Chapter 15. The increase and decrease of the number of people in a state chiefly depends on the taste, the fashions, and the ways of life of the property owners. Abstract. Population is based on the tastes and choices of property owners. Early versions of the Malthusian approach to population growth, that it follows some mathematical formula, are criticized. This chapter also shows that the opulence and lavish spending of the prince and absentee landlords living far from their lands was responsible for the poverty and declining population of France, which ultimately led to the French Revolution. Experience shows that trees, plants, and other kinds of vegetation can be increased to any quantity to the extent that the land allocated to them can support. The same experience shows that all animal species can be multiplied to any quantity that the land allotted to them can support. Horses, cattle, sheep can easily be multiplied up to the number that the land will support. One can even improve the fields allocated for this purpose by irrigation, as in Milan. Hay can be grown to raise cattle in stables and feed them in larger numbers than if they were allowed to freely roam in the fields. Sheep may be fed on turnips, as in England, so that more can be fed with an acre of land than if it were pasture. In a word, we can multiply all sorts of animals in such numbers as we wish to maintain, even to infinite numbers if we could find lands in infinite quantity to nourish them, and the multiplication of animals has no other bounds than the greater or lesser means allotted for their subsistence. There is no doubt that if all land was devoted to the simple subsistence of man, the race would increase up to the number that the land would support in the manner to be explained. There is no country where population is carried to a greater height than in China. The common people are supported by rice and rice water. They work almost naked in the southern provinces. They have 3 plentiful harvests of rice each year, thanks to the great care that they give to agriculture. The land is never fallow and yields more than 100-fold every year. Those who wear clothes generally have cotton clothing, which needs so little land for its production that an acre of land, it seems, is capable of producing a quantity of clothing sufficient for 500 adults. The Chinese, by the principles of their religion, are obliged to marry and raise as many children as their means of subsistence will afford. They look upon it as a crime to use land for pleasure gardens or parks, cheating the public of food. They transport travelers in sedan chairs and save the work of horses upon all tasks which men can perform. Their number is incredible according to the descriptions of China's visitors. However, they are forced to let many of their children die in the cradle when they are unable to support them, keeping only the number that they can feed. By hard and persistent labor, they draw from the rivers an extraordinary quantity of fish, and from the land, all that is possible. Nevertheless, when bad years come, they die of hunger by the thousands, in spite of the care of the emperor, who stores rice for such contingencies. Numerous then as the people of China are, they are necessarily proportioned to their means of living, and do not exceed the number the country can support, according to their standard of living, and on this level, a single acre of land will support many of them. On the other hand, there is no country where the increase of population is more limited than among the Native Americans in the interior parts of America. They neglect agriculture, live in forests, and live by the hunting of animals found there. As the trees consume the sap and substance of the earth, there is little pasture for animals, and since a Native American eats several animals in a year, 50 or 100 acres often supply only enough food for a single Native American. A small tribe will have 40 square leagues for its hunting grounds. They wage regular and bitter wars over these boundaries, and always proportion their numbers to their means of support from hunting. The Europeans cultivate the land and draw grain from it for their subsistence. The wool of their sheep provides them with clothing. Wheat is the grain on which most of them are fed, but some peasants make their bread of rye, and in the north from barley and oats. The food of the peasants and the people is not the same in all countries of Europe, and the land is often different in quality and in fertility. Most of the land in Flanders, and part of that in Lombardy, yields 18 to 20 times the wheat sown, without lying idle. The countryside of Naples yields even more. There are some parts of France, Spain, England, and Germany which yield the same amount. Cicero tells us that the land of Sicily in his time yielded tenfold, and the elder Pliny says that the Leontine lands in Sicily yielded 100 times the seed sown, those of Babylon 150 times, and some African lands a good deal more. Today, land in Europe yields on average 6 times what is sown, meaning that 5 times the seed remains for the consumption of the people. Land usually lays fallow for the third year, producing wheat the first year, and barley and oats the second. In the supplement, there are estimates of the amount of land required to support a man, according to the different assumptions made about his way of living. On the other hand, an adult man who wears leather shoes, stockings, woolen cloth, who lives in a house and has a change of linen, a bed, chairs, table, and other necessities, moderately drinks beer or wine, eats meat every day, butter, cheese, bread, vegetables, etc., sufficiently and yet moderately. On the other hand, an adult man who wears leather shoes, stockings, woolen cloth, who lives in a house and has a change of linen, a bed, chairs, table, and other necessities, moderately drinks beer or wine, eats meat every day, butter, cheese, bread, vegetables, etc., sufficiently and yet moderately needs less than the product of 4 to 5 acres of land of average quality. It is true that in these estimates no land is allotted for horses, except those needed to plow, and for the transport of these products a distance of 10 miles. History records that the first Romans each maintained his family on 2 journeaux of land equal to 1 parisacre and approximately 330 square feet. They were almost naked, had no wine or oil, slept in straw, and hardly had any comforts, but because they intensely cultivated the land, which is fairly good around Rome, they drew from it plenty of grains and vegetables. Footnote: 1 journeau was called a Roman jugerum, which was the unit of land of measurement equal to approximately 2/3 of an English acre. If the property owners had the desire to increase the population, they would encourage peasants to marry young and raise children by promising to provide them with subsistence, devoting the land entirely to that purpose, and they would doubtless increase the population up to the point that the land could support, according to the products allotted for each person, whether those of 1.5 acres or 4 to 5 acres. But if instead the prince or property owners made them use the land for other purposes than upkeep of the people, if, by the prices they offer in the market for commodities and merchandise, they determine that the farmers will employ the land for other purposes than the maintenance of men, for we have seen that the prices they offer in the market and their consumption determine the use of land, just as if they cultivated it themselves. The people will necessarily decrease in number. Some will be forced to leave the country for lack of employment, while others, not having the necessary means of raising children, will not marry or will only marry late after having saved up for the support of the household. If the property owners who live in the country move to the cities, far away from their land, horses must be fed for the transport of food into the city for both the owner and all the domestic servants, artisans, and others whom the residents in the city will attract. The transport of wine from Burgundy to Paris often costs more than the wine itself costs in Burgundy. Consequently, the land employed for the upkeep of wagon horses and those who look after them is more considerable than the land that produces the wine and supports those who have taken part in its production. The more horses that are in the state, the less food will remain for the people. The upkeep of wagon, hunting, or show horses often takes 3 to 4 acres of land each. But when the nobility and property owners draw from foreign manufacturers their clothes, silk, laces, etc., and pay for them by sending to the foreigner their native products, they significantly diminish the subsistence of the inhabitants and increase that of foreigners, who often become enemies of the state. If a nobleman or property owner in Poland, to whom his farmers yearly pay a rent equal about 1/3 of the product of his land, uses cloths, linens, etc. of Holland, he will pay for these goods 1/2 of the rent he receives, and perhaps use the other half for the subsistence of his family on other products and rough manufactures of Poland. However, half his rent, on our assumption, corresponds to 1/6 of the production of his land, and this 6th part will be carried away by the Dutch, to whom the farmers of Poland will deliver the wheat, wool, hemp, and other products. Here there is a 6th part of the land of Poland withdrawn from its people, to say nothing of the feeding of the wagon horses, carriage horses, and show horses maintained in Poland because of the lifestyle of the nobility. Furthermore, if out of the 2/3 of production of the land allotted to the farmers, the latter, imitating their masters, consume foreign manufactures that they also pay to the foreigners in raw products of Poland, there will be a good 1/3 of the production of the land in Poland removed from the food of the people and, what is worse, mostly sent to foreigners, often serving to support the enemies of the state. If the property owners and nobility in Poland would consume only the manufactures of their own state, bad as they may be at that outset, the products would soon become better, and it would maintain a greater number of their own people at work, instead of giving this advantage to foreigners. And if all the states took precautions not to be the dupes of other states in matters of commerce, each state would be considerable only in proportion to its products and the industry of its people. If the ladies of Paris enjoy wearing Brussels lace, and if France pays for this lace with champagne wine, the production of a single acre of flax must be paid for with the production of 16,000 acres of vineyards, if my calculations are correct. This will be more fully explained elsewhere, and the figures are shown in the supplement. Suffice it to say that in this transaction, a great amount of the production of the land is withdrawn from the subsistence of the French, and all the products are sent abroad, unless an equally considerable amount of the products is brought back in exchange, tend to diminish the number of people in the state. When I said that property owners might multiply the population as far as the land would support them, I assume that most men desire nothing better than to marry if they are set in a position to maintain their families in the same style as they are content to live themselves. That is, if a man is satisfied with the production of an acre and a half of land, he will marry if he is sure of having enough to maintain his family in the same style. However, if he is only satisfied with the product of 5 to 10 acres of land, he will be in no hurry to marry unless he thinks he can support his family in the same manner. In Europe, the children of the nobility are brought up in affluence, and as the largest share of the property is usually given to the eldest sons, the younger sons are in no hurry to marry. They usually live as bachelors, either in the army or in the monasteries, but will seldom be found unwilling to marry if they are offered heiresses and fortunes, or the means of supporting a family on the level they consider appropriate and without which they think they will make their children unhappy. In the lower classes of the state, there are also men who, from pride, and from reasons similar to those of the nobility, prefer to live in celibacy and to live on the little that they have, rather than settle down in family life. But most of them would gladly set up a family if they could count on supporting their family as they wish. They would consider it an injustice to their children if they brought them up only to fall into a lower class than themselves. Only a few men in a state avoid marriage because of a pure libertine spirit. All the lower classes wish to live and raise children who can live at least like themselves. When laborers and artisans do not marry, it is because they wait until they save enough to enable them to set up a household or to find some young woman who brings a little capital for that purpose. Every day, they see others like themselves who, for lack of such precautions, start a family and fall into the most frightful poverty, being obliged to deprive themselves of their own food in order to nourish their children. From the observations of Mr. Halley at Bruslaw in Silesia, a region in Poland, it is found that all the females capable of childbearing from 16 up to 45 years of age, not 1 in 6 actually bears a child every year. Instead, says Mr. Halley, there ought to be at least 4 in 6 who should have children every year, without including those who are barren or have stillbirths. The reason why 4 women out of the 6 do not bear children every year is that they cannot marry because of the discouragement and difficulties in their way. A young woman takes care not to become a mother if she is not married. She cannot marry unless she finds a man who is ready to run the risk of it. Most of the people in a state are hired or are entrepreneurs. Most are dependent and live in uncertainty whether they will find by their labor or their enterprise the means of supporting their household on an acceptable level. Therefore, they do not all marry, or marry so late that of 6 women, at least 4 should produce a child every year, but there is actually only 1 in 6 who becomes a mother. If the property owners help to support the families, a single generation would suffice to push the increase of population as far as the production of land will supply the means of subsistence. Children do not require as much of the land's production as adults. Both can live on more or less according to their consumption. The northern people, where the land produces little, have been known to live on so little production that they have sent out colonists and swarms of men to invade the lands of the south, destroy the inhabitants, and appropriate their land. According to the different manner of living, 400,000 people might subsist on the products of the land, which ordinarily supports only 100,000. A man who lives on the production of an acre and a half of land may be stronger and braver than the one who consumes the production of 5 or 10 acres. Therefore, it seems pretty clear that the number of inhabitants in a state depends on the means of subsistence, as the means of subsistence depend on the method of cultivating the soil, and this method depends chiefly on the taste, desires, and manner of living of the property owners. The increase and decrease of population also stand on the same foundation. The increase of population can be carried furthest in the countries where the people are content to live the most poorly and to consume the least production of the soil. In countries where all the peasants and laborers are accustomed to eat meat and drink wine, beer, etc., not many inhabitants can be supported. Sir William Petty, and after him Mr. Davenant, inspector of the customs in England, seem to depart from nature when they try to calculate the propagation of mankind by progressive generations from Adam, the first father. Their calculations seem to be purely imaginary and to be drawn up at random. On the basis of what they have seen of the actual birth rate in certain districts, how could they explain the decrease of those innumerable people formerly found in Asia, Egypt, etc., and even in Europe? If 17 centuries ago there were 26 million people in Italy, now reduced to 6 million at most, how can it be determined by the progressions of Mr. George King that England, which today contains 5 or 6 million inhabitants, will probably have 13 million in just a few years? We see daily that Englishmen, in general, consume more of the product of the land than their fathers did, and this is the real reason why there are fewer inhabitants than in the past. Men multiply like mice in a barn if they have unlimited means of subsistence. The English in the colonies will become more numerous in proportion in 3 generations than they would in 30 in England, because in the colonies they cultivate new tracts of land from which they expel the Native Americans. In all countries, at all times, men have waged wars for the land and the means of subsistence. When wars have destroyed or diminished the population of a country, the locals and civilized nations soon repopulate it in times of peace, especially when the prince and the property owners lend their encouragement. A state which has conquered several provinces may, by tribute imposed on the vanquished, acquire an increase of subsistence for its own people. The Romans drew a great part of their subsistence from Egypt, Sicily, and Africa, and that is why Italy then had so many inhabitants. A state where mines are found, where manufacturers do not require much of the production of land to export their goods to foreign countries, and which receives from them in exchange plentiful merchandise and commodities from the land, provides a larger subsistence fund for its subjects. The Dutch exchanged their labor in navigation, fishing, and manufacturing, principally with foreigners, for the products of their land. Otherwise, Holland could not support half of its population. England buys from abroad considerable amounts of timber, hemp, and other materials or products of the soil, and consumes much wine, for which she pays in minerals, manufactured goods, etc. That saves the English a great quantity of production of their soil. Without these advantages, the people of England, based on their standard of living, could not be as numerous as they are. The coal mines save them millions of acres of land which would otherwise be needed to grow timber. But all these advantages are refinements and exceptional cases, which I mention only incidentally. The natural and constant way of increasing a population in a state is to find employment for the people there and to make the land provide their means of support. It is also a question outside of my subject whether it is better to have a great multitude of inhabitants, poor and badly provided for, or a smaller number with better means, 1 million who consume the product of 6 acres per head, or 4 million who live on the product of an acre and a half.